What happens when a royal family decides that one of its own is no longer welcome? When traditions clash with rebellion, when loyalty is tested against personal ambition, and when centuries of royal protocol collide with modern scandal. This is the story of Prince Harry being shut out, excluded, and publicly rejected from the very events that define the monarchy he was born into. And at the center of it all, Princess and the royal known for her unwavering sense of duty. Finally saying the words that would shock the palace. Enough. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A glance here, a whispered conversation there, a slight hesitation in an invitation. To the casual observer, it might have seemed trivial, even mundane. But for those living within the gilded walls of royal estates, these small cracks were the first signs of a seismic split. Prince Harry, once celebrated as the playful, charming younger brother, was now increasingly viewed as a liability, a disruptor, a symbol of modern rebellion threatening the centuries-old traditions of the British monarchy. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine growing up in one of the most publicized families in history. Cameras following your every move, tabloids dissecting your choices, and millions worldwide judging your every decision. Now imagine that within that world, the bond you thought unbreakable begins to fray. That was the reality for Harry and William. Once inseparable, the brothers who had laughed, played, and leaned on each other during some of life's toughest moments were slowly drifting into two opposing worlds. One steeped in protocol and duty, the other seeking autonomy and self-definition. By now, many of you might be wondering, what could have caused such an irreparable divide? Was it Meghan? Was it public statements, Netflix deals, or leaked interviews? Or was it something deeper, something hidden behind palace doors, known only to a select few? The truth is more complicated, more intricate, and far more shocking than most headlines would have you believe. The unfolding story is one of power, pride, betrayal, and family dynamics that are both intensely personal and brutally public. It all came to a head at events that were supposed to be celebrations of tradition, of service, of unity. Royal galas, commemorative ceremonies, and high-profile public gatherings became stages for silent battles. Invitations, once mundane formalities, were now loaded with significance. Each envelope sent, or deliberately withheld, sent a message that echoed louder than any official statement. And when Prince Harry found himself repeatedly uninvited, publicly snubbed, and quietly excluded, it wasn't just a personal slight. It was a royal declaration. Princess, and often overlooked in popular discussions of the royal family, had watched this unfold with growing concern. Known for her no-nonsense approach, her fierce commitment to duty, and her unwillingness to tolerate chaos within the monarchy, she had remained quiet for years, observing, calculating, and waiting for the moment when intervention was necessary. And then it came. Anne's decision to speak up, to assert boundaries, to declare that the situation had gone too far, sent shockwaves through the palace hierarchy. Her words weren't just a suggestion, they were a decree. Enough. But what did this really mean for Prince Harry? For the monarchy? For a global audience that had watched Harry's life in excruciating detail for decades? The stakes were monumental. Being uninvited was more than a social slight. It was a public marker of disfavor, a signal that even family could enforce boundaries in ways that were both formal and unforgiving. And while the media eagerly speculated, the insiders knew the truth was far more nuanced, far more painful, and far more revealing of human nature under pressure than any headline could convey. This is not just a story about royal etiquette or missed invitations. This is a story about trust broken, bonds severed, and the invisible rules that govern one of the world's most watched families. It is about the balance of duty versus desire, tradition versus modernity, and loyalty versus personal freedom. And in the center of this storm stands two brothers, each convinced of their own righteousness, each hurt in ways the world cannot fully see, and each struggling to navigate a public life where every action, every gesture, and every word carries disproportionate weight. Ask yourself, how would you react if you were suddenly told you were no longer welcome at family gatherings, not because of wrongdoing in the traditional sense, but because your presence was deemed disruptive? Could you accept it gracefully, fight it publicly, or retreat quietly into exile. Prince Harry faced exactly that dilemma, with an entire world watching his every choice. The psychological toll alone is almost unimaginable. Living with the constant knowledge that your family, the people who are supposed to protect and support you, have decided that your presence is no longer desired. And yet, even in the midst of these dramatic and painful circumstances, the palace machine moved forward with an almost clinical precision. Invitations were sent according to a carefully constructed hierarchy. Messages were delivered with subtlety that only insiders could decode, and protocols were enforced with a rigidity that left little room for compromise. Every detail mattered. Every slight, intentional or otherwise, sent ripples through the family and the public alike. For Harry, each exclusion was both a personal rejection and a public statement. That the monarchy was willing to sacrifice even family relationships to maintain the image, order, and authority it had built over centuries. But perhaps the most shocking element of all is how this story touches on the universal human experience. Despite the glitz, the privilege, and the global scrutiny, at its core, this is a story about family, about loyalty, love, and the pain that comes when bonds break. It is about the collision between personal identity and societal expectation, and about the cost of defying long-held traditions. And when Princess Anne finally decided to step in, it became clear that the internal pressures had reached a tipping point. Her intervention was a signal that no amount of charm, celebrity, or public sympathy could override the internal logic of the royal hierarchy. So what happens next? How does a family navigate such deep divisions in the public eye? What does it take for a royal to go from celebrated insider to uninvited outsider? And perhaps most importantly, what does this mean for the future of the monarchy itself? These questions will drive the narrative of this exposé, revealing secrets, shedding light on behind-the-scenes tensions, and exploring the emotional landscapes of a family under extraordinary pressure. And just as you think you understand the story, just as you feel you've glimpsed the full picture, the palace delivers another twist. Another subtle maneuver, another calculated message, another public gesture that changes everything. The exclusion of Prince Harry is not a singular event. It is a thread in a complex tapestry of alliances, grievances, and long-held expectations. And the consequences of that exclusion will reverberate far beyond a single event or a single invitation. What happens when the bond you thought unbreakable begins to crumble before your very eyes? For Prince William and Prince Harry, this was not a sudden betrayal or a single explosive argument. It was a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of trust, shared memories, and mutual understanding. Once inseparable, the brothers had spent decades side by side, navigating the glare of the world together, leaning on each other through tragedies that would have crushed most families. But over time, that bond, forged in privilege and circumstance, began to fray in ways that were deeply personal and shockingly public. Imagine growing up under the relentless scrutiny of the media. Every action, every smile, every minor misstep dissected by millions of people. For most siblings, childhood disagreements fade into memory. For William and Harry, each disagreement was amplified, published, and scrutinized globally. But in spite of that pressure, they had once been the ultimate team. Partners in mischief, protectors of each other's vulnerabilities, and sources of laughter during the darkest moments. The untimely death of their mother, Princess Diana, when they were just children, cemented that bond. In those early years of grief, Harry leaned on William, William leaned on Harry. Together, they navigated a world that seemed determined to exploit their pain. Yet, as they grew older, subtle differences began to emerge. William, the elder by 3 years, took to heart the responsibilities of monarchy with a seriousness that bordered on solemnity. From a young age, he was groomed to assume the role of future king. Every lesson, every public appearance, every expectation reinforced a path that demanded discipline, obedience, and unwavering respect for tradition. Harry, on the other hand, chafed against constraints. He was spirited, impulsive, and determined to carve out his own identity separate from the shadow of his older brother. Where William saw duty, Harry sometimes saw confinement. Where William saw legacy, Harry sought freedom. And yet, for years, the differences were manageable. Their shared experiences and mutual understanding provided a buffer against growing tension. There were still moments of laughter, teasing, and support. But cracks, no matter how small, eventually widen under relentless pressure. Harry's relationships, his choice of Meghan Markle as a partner, and his increasingly public challenges to royal expectations began to strain that buffer. William, who had been raised to protect the monarchy above all else, saw those choices as threats, not only to the family's image but to the centuries-old institution itself. Here's where things start to get really complicated. While the public often sees the headlines, they rarely understand the intricate web of palace politics, unwritten rules, and personal expectations. Behind the velvet curtains, the brothers' relationship was tested in ways that the world could not witness. Arguments erupted over seemingly minor issues, but were loaded with deeper meaning. Invitations to events, decisions about public appearances, and even the way their children were introduced to the world became points of contention. What might have seemed trivial to outsiders, such as seating arrangements or minor protocol breaches, was, in reality, a battleground for respect, authority, and familial hierarchy. The media, of course, played its role in magnifying these tensions. Every misstep, every terse comment, every carefully staged photograph was scrutinized. And while Harry often sought independence and personal expression, William was being watched as the future king. Any deviation, any perceived insubordination, threatened not just his role, but the stability of the monarchy itself. The brothers were no longer just siblings. They were symbols, avatars of tradition and rebellion, each representing opposing forces within the same family. Consider the psychological toll of such an environment. Imagine constantly being measured, compared, and judged, not just by your family, but by millions of strangers worldwide. Imagine watching your every action dissected, your every word analyzed, and your every choice debated in public forums. For Harry, this pressure compounded his natural desire for autonomy. For William, it reinforced the necessity of control, structure, and adherence to protocol. Over time, these opposing approaches created an emotional chasm between them, one that would prove nearly impossible to bridge. And then there were the moments that no one saw. The private arguments, the whispered frustrations, the silent judgments exchanged behind closed doors. Harry reportedly felt that William was often unsympathetic to his struggles, viewing them through the lens of duty rather than empathy. William, in turn, reportedly saw Harry as reckless, unpredictable, and willing to jeopardize the very institution that he had spent his life preparing to uphold. Every encounter, no matter how small, became a test of patience, endurance, and understanding. As the years passed, these tensions spilled into public view. Interviews, memoirs, and even casual statements became sources of tension. Every revelation about family disagreements fueled speculation, and every unspoken grievance created a fertile ground for rumor. The world watched as two brothers, once united by tragedy and love, slowly drifted into opposing camps, their bond strained by circumstance, expectation, and the relentless glare of fame. But even as cracks widened, there were moments of reconciliation, brief glimpses of the bond they once shared. A joke, a gesture, a public smile. All of these moments reminded the world that beneath the tensions, a connection still existed. It was fragile, tenuous, and constantly threatened by new developments. Yet it was there, a reminder of the deep, complicated love that siblings can feel, even when they are at odds. Then came the turning points that would define the next chapter of their relationship. Events where Harry's presence was questioned, invitations subtly altered, and decisions that placed the brothers on opposing sides of the same table. These were not mere social slights. They were deliberate acts of boundary setting, clear signals that the dynamics had changed irrevocably. And when Princess Anne began to intervene, the stakes escalated even further. The family was no longer just managing differences. They were navigating outright conflict with clear consequences. Ask yourself this. How would you handle such a situation if you were in Harry's shoes? To be excluded not because of moral failing, but because your mere presence challenged tradition? To be publicly questioned and privately chastised, all while trying to maintain composure in front of the world? It is an almost unimaginable pressure, and yet it is the reality that Harry faced, a reality that would shape his choices, his public persona, and his very place in the monarchy. And William, on the other hand, faced his own pressures. The heir to the throne must maintain stability, command respect, and project unity, even when personal relationships are strained. Any public display of favoritism, leniency, or indecision could be interpreted as weakness. In this light, William's increasingly firm stance toward Harry was not merely fraternal judgment. It was a calculated effort to protect the institution, even if it came at the cost of brotherly affection. By now, the stage was set for a conflict that would captivate the world. The fractured bond between the brothers was no longer a private matter. Invitations, public appearances, and the subtle orchestration of events became instruments of a larger struggle. A struggle for respect, authority, and ultimately, identity within one of the most scrutinized families on the planet. Every choice, every gesture, every public statement was loaded with meaning. And in this high-stakes environment, even the smallest misstep could have monumental consequences. And yet, despite everything, the story is not without nuance. It is not simply a tale of betrayal and resentment. It is a complex portrait of family, loyalty, and the conflicting demands of duty versus personal freedom. It is about the ways in which love can coexist with disappointment, hope with frustration, and connection with estrangement. And it is precisely this complexity that makes the unfolding drama between William and Harry so compelling, so relatable, and so shocking to audiences worldwide. What happens when a new figure enters an already tense family dynamic and changes everything overnight? For Prince Harry, Meghan Markle's arrival was nothing short of transformative, but not always in the ways the world might expect. Some viewed her as a breath of fresh air, a modernizing force who could help the royal family connect with a global audience. Others saw disruption, rebellion, and a threat to centuries of tradition. And for William, her presence became a lightning rod for frustration, tension, and a growing divide between the brothers. The story begins with the first public appearances. Harry met Meghan in 2016, and from the start, there was undeniable chemistry. But chemistry, in a royal context, is never just personal, it is political. Every smile, handshake, and public gesture is analyzed, interpreted, and politicized. The palace, with its centuries-old protocols, watched closely. Harry, who had long chafed against the strictures of royalty, seemed invigorated, energized by Meghan's independence, confidence, and modern outlook. To him, she represented freedom from a system that he often found suffocating. Yet, as their relationship developed, cracks began to appear, not in their love, but in how it collided with the palace machine. Meghan, a biracial American actress with a strong independent streak, was unaccustomed to the rigid hierarchy of British royalty. Where the institution demanded compliance, Meghan demanded respect. Where tradition expected silence, she spoke up. And where the family assumed control, she asserted autonomy. This clash of cultures, personalities, and expectations was bound to create friction. William's perspective, naturally, was shaped by duty. He understood the monarchy not just as a family, but as an institution with a delicate public image and centuries of history to uphold. To him, every deviation from protocol, every unorthodox decision, every perceived challenge to the monarchy's authority was a potential threat. And Meghan, intentionally or not, embodied many of those challenges. Her influence on Harry, her outspoken nature, and her modern approach to royal life were all factors that widened the emotional distance between the brothers. The media, of course, had a field day. Headlines alternated between adoration and condemnation, often on the same day. Some portrayed Meghan as a hero, an advocate for gender equality, a woman challenging outdated norms, and a loving partner to Harry. Others painted her as a manipulator, a disruptor, and a force driving a wedge between the royal siblings. The narrative oscillated wildly, fueling speculation and intensifying scrutiny. Every step Meghan took, every comment she made, became fodder for public debate, and every debate pushed the brothers further apart. But the tension wasn't just public. It was profoundly personal. Friends, insiders, and palace staff noticed subtle changes in interactions. Private conversations that once flowed freely became measured. Jokes that had always been understood were now misinterpreted. Family gatherings, once a sanctuary of shared memories, became stages of silent negotiation, tense glances, and careful diplomacy. Harry, who had long relied on William for guidance, now found himself in conflict with both his brother and the institution he had once idolized. Consider the psychological impact. Harry, already burdened by the trauma of losing his mother, suddenly faced criticism not just from the public, but from the very family he loved. The woman he adored, his partner, confidant, and equal, was under attack, and by association, so was he. William, conversely, had to balance his role as future king with his desire to maintain a connection to his brother. It was a delicate tightrope walk, one where missteps could have personal, familial, and institutional consequences. Then came the subtle incidents that fueled media speculation: seating arrangements at official events, perceived snubs in interviews, and public gestures interpreted as signs of disapproval. Harry and Meghan's public behavior was scrutinized, dissected, and often misrepresented. The palace's responses, or lack thereof, were similarly analyzed, with every statement carrying weight. And while outsiders saw a glamorous couple navigating royal life, insiders recognized a family on the brink of a historic schism. One of the pivotal moments came during interviews and documentaries that Meghan participated in. Her candidness, while empowering to some, created ripples of discomfort within the palace. She questioned tradition, spoke openly about mental health, and addressed issues that had long been considered taboo in royal circles. For William, this wasn't just challenging. It was alarming. Every word broadcast to millions worldwide had the potential to destabilize the family's carefully curated image. And while Harry defended Meghan fiercely, his loyalty created further friction with William, who increasingly saw the younger brother as siding against the institution rather than with it. Then there was the element of race, often unspoken but profoundly impactful. Meghan's identity as a biracial American woman added layers of complexity to the situation. Palace insiders, journalists, and even global audiences debated how her presence and treatment intersected with issues of privilege, bias, and modern social expectations. For Harry, this was deeply personal. He saw the scrutiny and subtle hostilities his wife endured and felt compelled to protect her at all costs. For William, it was a challenge to balance empathy with the responsibility to uphold tradition, a task fraught with tension and potential missteps. The international spotlight only intensified the divide. Every royal event, every public appearance, every charitable initiative became a stage on which tensions were silently displayed. Fans, critics, and media outlets alike dissected interactions, searching for clues about the brothers' relationship. Yet the full story remained obscured behind palace walls, leaving speculation to dominate public perception. The narrative became not just about family dynamics, but about the monarchy's ability to adapt or resist the changing demands of the modern world. And Harry himself underwent a transformation. Once playful and carefree, he became increasingly aware of the pressure surrounding him. His loyalty to Meghan, his desire to assert autonomy, and his struggle with the family's expectations created a storm of internal conflict. Friends and insiders noted changes in his demeanor. Moments of anger, frustration, and deep sadness. The tension between personal freedom and familial duty became impossible to ignore, and each public or private misstep was magnified under the relentless scrutiny of the world. William, too, was not immune to the emotional toll. As future king, his actions were under constant observation. Every decision regarding Harry, every statement to staff or family, every public engagement was weighed against centuries of precedent. His love for his brother was tempered by a commitment to the monarchy, creating an internal conflict that few outside the palace could truly understand. The balance between family loyalty and institutional responsibility had never been more delicate or more precarious. The Meghan effect, then, was not simply about Harry's choice of spouse. It was about the collision of modernity and tradition, of personal desire and institutional expectation, of love and duty. It amplified existing tensions, revealed hidden fractures, and forced both brothers to confront questions that had been long avoided. How far would they go to protect their loved ones? How much compromise was acceptable? And what, ultimately, did loyalty to family mean in a world defined by public perception and centuries-old protocol? And just when it seemed the divide had reached its peak, subtle yet unmistakable signs emerged that the palace was taking action. Invitations were adjusted, roles were redefined, and the message became clear. Harry's position within the family was no longer guaranteed. The very presence of Meghan at events, once celebrated, was now a point of contention, a symbol of the rift that had grown too wide to ignore. And as the media speculated and the public debated, the brothers faced a reality that was both inevitable and devastating. Their relationship, strained as it was about to face its most public and consequential test yet. What happens when centuries of tradition collide head-on with modern desires for autonomy and self-expression? For Prince Harry, this conflict has been at the heart of his public and private struggles. Born into an institution defined by strict rules, hierarchies, and an unbroken chain of protocol, Harry has spent his life navigating a world where every action is monitored, every word is analyzed, and every deviation carries consequences not just for him, but for the monarchy itself. Yet, alongside this environment of scrutiny and expectation exists a simple human desire: to be free, to make your own choices, and to live a life defined by personal values rather than inherited obligations. The tension between protocol and freedom is not merely philosophical. It has tangible consequences. In the royal context, protocol is more than etiquette. It is the glue that holds the institution together. Seating arrangements at events, titles, modes of address, and even the way family members are introduced to the public are all dictated by centuries of precedent. Every breach, intentional or otherwise, risks signaling disorder or undermining authority. And when Harry began to challenge these norms, even subtly, it set off alarms in the palace. What outsiders might perceive as minor rebellions were, in reality, threats to the perceived stability of the monarchy. Consider Harry's decision-making process. On one hand, he understood the significance of tradition, the importance of respecting history, maintaining order, and protecting his family's legacy. On the other, he felt suffocated by constraints, frustrated by what he saw as rigidity, and compelled to assert a sense of self that was often at odds with expectation. This duality created constant tension. Every decision, from public interviews to personal appearances, was a balancing act between honoring the institution and asserting personal freedom. This tension became most visible during public engagements and royal ceremonies. Protocol dictates everything from attire to posture, from the order of arrivals to the allocation of honors. While William embraced these traditions, often appearing calm, composed, and authoritative, Harry's approach was markedly different. He sought to modernize, to humanize, and to connect with the public on his own terms. To some, this was refreshing. To others, it was insubordination. And for William, every deviation was a reminder that his brother was not only breaking with tradition, but also influencing public perception in ways that could be destabilizing. It is here that the friction between the brothers intensified. William, as the heir apparent, is tasked with upholding the monarchy's credibility. Harry, in his pursuit of personal freedom, was challenging that very credibility. Arguments over minor protocol breaches were not simply disagreements. They were clashes of ideology. Should personal expression take precedence over centuries of precedent? Should love, empathy, and individuality outweigh duty, obligation, and tradition? These questions are not theoretical. They affect public perception, family cohesion, and the monarchy's global standing. The consequences of this tension were not limited to abstract debates. They manifested in very concrete ways. Invitations to events became fraught with significance. Seating arrangements, once mundane, now carried symbolic weight. Even decisions about which charitable causes Harry and Meghan could publicly endorse were scrutinized for alignment with tradition versus innovation. In these micro-decisions, the battle between personal freedom and protocol played out daily, subtly, but powerfully influencing the brothers' relationship. Adding fuel to the fire were public statements and media appearances. Every time Harry or Meghan spoke candidly about mental health, social issues, or personal experiences, it was interpreted through the lens of royal expectation. To many insiders, these statements violated unspoken rules about discretion that had governed the monarchy for generations. Harry's willingness to speak openly, while applauded by some, was viewed by others, including William, as destabilizing and disrespectful. The tension between speaking one's truth and maintaining protocol became a recurring point of contention. It wasn't only about rules, it was also about perception. In a family so invested in appearances, breaking protocol carries symbolic weight. To break a rule is to challenge authority. To ignore hierarchy is to question legitimacy. And when Harry began asserting his independence, the palace interpreted it as both personal rebellion and institutional threat. William's response, increasingly firm and deliberate, was meant to reinforce boundaries, yet it also deepened the emotional divide between the brothers. Consider also the personal toll. For Harry, the conflict between freedom and duty was exhausting. Imagine living a life where every choice is scrutinized, where autonomy is seen as defiance, and where the desire to live authentically is interpreted as betrayal. The psychological pressure is immense. Harry has spoken publicly about struggles with mental health, pressures of public life, and the burden of expectation. These pressures are intensified when familial relationships, particularly those with a brother you once relied upon, are strained by competing priorities and conflicting values. Meanwhile, William faced his own unique pressures. As heir to the throne, he must embody stability, control, and reliability. He is judged not just by family or media, but by a nation and an institution with centuries of history. Every decision he makes regarding Harry is scrutinized as an indicator of his leadership capabilities. Balancing the role of a protective older brother with the responsibility of preserving institutional integrity creates a psychological burden that is often invisible to the public eye. These tensions were magnified when Meghan entered the picture. Her modern approach, assertive personality, and insistence on autonomy intensified the friction between personal freedom and protocol. To Harry, Meghan represented support, partnership, and validation. To William, her presence highlighted the challenges of enforcing tradition in a rapidly changing world. Every joint public appearance, every charitable engagement, every interview became a site of negotiation between these competing forces, with both brothers navigating the precarious line between family loyalty and institutional duty. One pivotal example of this tension can be seen in public ceremonies where Harry's presence or absence carried disproportionate weight. Royal protocol dictated certain behaviors, seating positions, and roles for events. Deviating from these norms, even slightly, could send unintended messages. Harry's choices, whether influenced by personal values, Meghan's perspective, or both, often conflicted with these expectations. William's response, in turn, was to assert boundaries, enforce protocol, and reinforce the institution's hierarchy, actions that, while logical within the royal framework, created emotional friction that was impossible to ignore. And yet, this chapter of the brothers' lives is not simply a story of conflict. It is also a story of human complexity. The tension between duty and freedom is universal. Each of us has faced moments where our desires conflict with expectations, where personal authenticity collides with external pressures. For Harry and William, the stakes are exponentially higher, but the emotional truths are relatable. Love, loyalty, and identity are constantly weighed against obligation, tradition, and external judgment. And it is in this struggle that the drama unfolds, revealing both the fragility and resilience of familial bonds. But the palace hierarchy is not passive. Decisions about invitations, events, and public roles are rarely arbitrary. They are carefully calculated signals, meant to communicate favor, disfavor, and boundaries without overt confrontation. When Harry began asserting his freedom in ways perceived as disruptive, the palace's response was methodical, deliberate, and increasingly firm. Invitations were adjusted, roles redefined, and boundaries made explicit. Every exclusion, every omission, was a message. Personal freedom cannot override the rules of the monarchy. Ask yourself this: if you were in Harry's position, would you conform for the sake of tradition? Or would you assert your independence, knowing the personal and public costs? And if you were in William's position, how would you balance loyalty to a brother with duty to an institution that spans centuries? These questions are not hypothetical. They are the very dilemmas that define the relationship between the two brothers, and they form the emotional backbone of a story that has captivated the world. The tension between royal protocol and personal freedom is far from theoretical. It sets the stage for the events that follow, the public exclusions, the unspoken judgments, and the deliberate enforcement of boundaries that would ultimately lead to Harry being uninvited from key royal events. This is the crucible in which family relationships are tested, loyalties are questioned, and the consequences of choices become unavoidable. Imagine walking into a room where you were once celebrated, welcomed, and considered an integral part of the family, and realizing, with a sinking feeling, that you are no longer wanted. That is exactly the moment Prince Harry faced at his first major royal event after tensions with William, Meghan, and the palace had reached a boiling point. The stakes were high, the atmosphere electric, and every glance, whisper, and gesture was loaded with meaning. To the world, it may have seemed like another glittering royal gathering. But for Harry, it was a moment that would redefine his position within the monarchy forever. The story begins in the weeks leading up to the event. Invitations were sent with precision, carefully curated lists drafted by palace officials. Those who were loyal, discreet, and aligned with protocol received their notices promptly. Those whose presence might stir controversy, or whose alignment was uncertain, were either subtly discouraged or omitted entirely. In this context, Harry's absence, or the lack of a formal invitation, was not an oversight. It was a calculated message. But human nature being what it is, hope persists. Perhaps there had been a mistake. Perhaps a last-minute arrangement could allow him entry. And so, despite the tension, Harry arrived, uncertain, curious, and perhaps a little defiant. The atmosphere as he entered the room was immediately noticeable. A hush fell over certain corners of the gathering. Whispers flickered like candlelight across the room. Who had let him in? Should he have been here? Eyes darted toward William, who stood as a picture of composure, the unspoken enforcer of protocol. William's gaze, cool and deliberate, sent a clear signal without a word being spoken. Harry was not officially welcome. The subtlety of the moment was extraordinary. No confrontation, no argument, yet a message as powerful as any formal declaration. Consider the psychological impact of such a moment. For Harry, it was a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and anger. To be present yet effectively excluded is worse than outright rejection. It communicates that your presence is tolerated only grudgingly, that your very being disrupts the delicate equilibrium of family and institution. And for William, this was an exercise in control, authority, and signaling. By allowing Harry to remain visible yet subtly sidelined, he reinforced the hierarchy while minimizing public spectacle. A masterstroke of silent enforcement. The subtle cues were everywhere. Seating arrangements, once trivial, now conveyed social judgment. Handshakes were brief, smiles measured, and conversations limited. Allies who had once been friendly now hesitated, unsure how to interact without signaling disloyalty. The room was a microcosm of the larger conflict, a delicate ballet of protocol, tension, and emotional signaling. For those who knew how to read the signs, the exclusion was unmistakable. For the public, it was largely invisible, but the ripples were profound, both within the family and beyond. The media coverage, naturally, picked up on subtle hints. Observers noted the fleeting interactions, the stiff smiles, and the unusual absence of Harry from photos where he would typically appear. Headlines speculated. Was he uninvited? Was there a rift? Was this a prelude to more dramatic actions? Each story fueled curiosity, increased scrutiny, and heightened tension within the palace. Every detail of that night became a talking point, a puzzle for commentators and fans alike, and an invisible battlefield where every gesture carried meaning. But the uninvited guest scenario was more than just a public spectacle. It was deeply personal. Harry, who had grown up under scrutiny, now faced exclusion from the very family that shaped his identity. Memories of childhood camaraderie, shared grief over Diana's death, and moments of joy with William now contrasted starkly with the cold, measured reception he received. The juxtaposition of past warmth with present alienation created emotional dissonance that was nearly unbearable. Each step, each glance, and each passing conversation reinforced the reality. He was no longer fully welcome. Inside the palace, whispers and speculation flew. Staff members, long accustomed to subtle power plays, read every detail with precision. Who would sit where? Who would be acknowledged first? How would Harry respond to being positioned on the periphery? In these small but crucial details, the palace communicated expectations, enforced hierarchy, and tested boundaries. And Harry, for all his charm and resilience, was forced to navigate a minefield where missteps could escalate conflict instantly. Consider the broader implications. Being uninvited or subtly excluded is not just a personal slight. It sends signals to allies, staff, and the global audience. It delineates lines of loyalty, defines acceptable behavior, and communicates consequences without overt confrontation. In this context, Harry's presence in the room, welcome yet simultaneously sidelined, was both a punishment and a warning. It conveyed that defiance of tradition would not be tolerated, even by a brother who once shared his deepest confidences. The emotional spike of the night came in fleeting moments that outsiders might have missed. A slight hesitation before greeting, a brief exchange of words that ended abruptly, a lingering look of disappointment. All of these elements conveyed volumes. Friends and observers later described the tension as palpable, almost tangible. It was a scene of unspoken battles, quiet humiliation, and controlled authority. Every gesture told a story, every expression conveyed intent, and every omission had meaning. Yet Harry's response was complex. He did not storm out. He did not confront William publicly. Instead, he navigated the room with careful diplomacy, engaging selectively and maintaining composure. To outsiders, he appeared gracious and polite. To insiders, every measured action was a statement of resilience, a subtle assertion of presence in a space where he was technically unwelcome. This balance between defiance and decorum reflected Harry's awareness of the stakes. One wrong move, one overt expression of anger, could escalate the situation dramatically, impacting both personal relationships and public perception. Meanwhile, William's posture was equally deliberate. His calm, controlled demeanor reinforced authority without creating overt confrontation. Every gesture, every nod, and every word was designed to maintain the equilibrium of protocol while sending a clear message to his younger brother. In this way, William exercised the quiet power of the institution itself, visible, authoritative, and unyielding, yet meticulously controlled. And then there were the allies, those who found themselves caught between loyalty to Harry and adherence to protocol. Staff members, family friends, and advisors had to carefully calibrate their behavior. A smile here, a nod there, seemingly insignificant actions became politically charged gestures. Every interaction was fraught with meaning. Every choice weighed against centuries of tradition and the immediate emotional climate. The tension extended far beyond Harry and William, touching everyone in the room and creating a ripple effect of unease, speculation, and calculated diplomacy. Ask yourself, how would you navigate a space where every action is scrutinized, every gesture analyzed, and every relationship tested? How would it feel to be present yet sidelined, acknowledged yet excluded, welcomed yet unwelcome? For Harry, this was the reality, a moment that crystallized the growing divide with his brother, highlighted the influence of Meghan, and foreshadowed the increasingly public and dramatic fallout to come. But as the evening unfolded, subtle maneuvers by the palace signaled that this was only the beginning. The uninvited guest scenario was not an isolated incident. It was the opening act in a sequence of events designed to establish boundaries, reinforce hierarchy, and assert control. And for Harry, the realization was inescapable. His presence would no longer be taken for granted, his actions would be watched more closely than ever, and his relationship with William, and with the monarchy itself, was entering uncharted, precarious territory. Sometimes, change comes not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, authoritative voice cutting through the chaos. For the British royal family, that voice belongs to Princess and the Queen's only daughter, known for her steadfast sense of duty, her no-nonsense approach, and her unwavering commitment to protocol. In the growing rift between Prince William and Prince Harry, Anne had been observing silently, weighing actions and measuring consequences. And then, the moment arrived when her intervention became not just necessary, but inevitable. The story begins in private corridors, far from the prying eyes of the press and public, and, acutely aware of the familial tensions, had been briefed on the escalating situation. The subtle exclusions, the fraud events, and the growing divide between the brothers. She understood the stakes in a way few outsiders, or even family members, truly could. The monarchy is built on order, hierarchy, and tradition, but it is also a family. The collision of these two realities had created a volatile mix, and Anne realized that if no one acted, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for Harry and William, but for the reputation and stability of the entire institution. Anne's intervention was deliberate. She did not enter with anger or judgment. She entered with clarity and authority. Known for her directness, she did not sugarcoat the situation. She laid out the consequences of continued breaches of protocol, the implications of public disputes, and the emotional toll on the family as a whole. Her approach was surgical. She did not accuse. She did not berate. She presented facts, consequences, and expectations, leaving no room for misinterpretation. It was at this moment that the message crystallized. Harry could no longer expect automatic inclusion at royal events. The rules were clear, and the enforcement would be firm. Anne's words were not just an admonishment, they were a declaration. Enough. No longer could personal grievances, media attention, or individual desires override the carefully structured hierarchy of the royal family. Anne's intervention effectively placed the weight of the institution behind William's increasingly firm stance, signaling to Harry that boundaries would no longer be flexible, no matter his intentions or popularity. The significance of and stepping in cannot be overstated. While William had authority as heir apparent and wielded influence that transcended position, she was respected, feared, and understood the intricate dance of royal protocol like few others. Her involvement added legitimacy to the actions taken against Harry. No longer was it simply William asserting control over his younger brother. It was the monarchy itself, through one of its most disciplined and influential members, enforcing order. The fallout was immediate and multifaceted. For Harry, it was a stark realization that the dynamics of power in the family had shifted. He had previously relied on private negotiations, personal appeals, and public perception to navigate conflicts. But now, Anne's authoritative intervention made it clear that the rules were no longer negotiable. Every decision, every appearance, every move would be monitored and judged, and deviation would carry concrete consequences. Consider the psychological impact of such a moment. Harry, already grappling with feelings of exclusion and betrayal, faced a reality in which even well-intentioned actions could be interpreted as transgressions. Anne's involvement underscored the seriousness of the situation. The monarchy was unified in its expectation, and there was no longer a pathway to circumvent boundaries through charm, influence, or public support. For someone accustomed to exercising personal autonomy, this was a formidable challenge. Meanwhile, Anne's decision also reflected a strategic calculation. By intervening, she prevented further escalation, reinforced hierarchy, and communicated to staff, allies, and the public that the palace was in control. Every detail of her approach was meticulously considered. Tone, timing, and method all designed to achieve maximum clarity without causing public spectacle. For insiders, it was a masterclass in crisis management. For the public, the implications would become clearer in the weeks and months to follow. The response from William was equally calculated. While Anne provided the authority, William's role was to enforce the boundaries, ensure compliance, and maintain consistency across events and appearances. Their partnership in this situation highlighted the strategic use of family hierarchy and provided clarity. William provided enforcement, and Harry received a clear, undeniable signal that the balance of power had shifted decisively. Yet the emotional dimension cannot be ignored. Anne's intervention, while necessary from a protocol standpoint, carried personal weight. She was not merely acting as an enforcer of rules. She was mediating a conflict that involved her nephew, her son, and her broader family. The delicate balance between fairness, loyalty, and duty required her to navigate emotional minefields as carefully as logistical ones. Every word, every gesture, every choice had to reinforce authority while maintaining credibility and trust. A monumental task given the intensity of the familial tensions. Publicly, Anne's influence remained subtle. There were no press conferences, no official statements, no overt displays of authority. Instead, her actions and guidance worked quietly behind the scenes, shaping events, communications, and relationships. Staff members, event planners, and royal aides adjusted behaviors in response to her directives. Invitations were reconsidered, seating arrangements recalibrated, and protocols reinforced. The message was unmistakable. The monarchy's expectations were non-negotiable, and deviation would have consequences. For Harry, the consequences soon became tangible. Invitations that were previously automatic now required approval. Events that had been assumed as guaranteed appearances were now contingent, conditional, and carefully monitored. Every public engagement became a negotiation between personal choice and institutional expectation. The unspoken understanding was clear. To maintain inclusion, Harry would need to navigate a narrow path between personal autonomy and obedience to royal protocol, a balancing act with very real emotional and relational stakes. Consider the broader implications. Anne's intervention signaled to staff, the media, and the public that the palace was unified. It reinforced the authority of William as heir apparent and established, and as a stabilizing force within the family. More importantly, it communicated that the rules of inclusion and exclusion were not merely social niceties. They were mechanisms of control, leverage, and institutional preservation. In other words, Harry's presence, participation, and autonomy were now contingent on adherence to rules he had previously challenged, creating a tension that would define the next phase of royal dynamics. And yet, despite Anne's intervention and the recalibration of boundaries, the situation remained fragile. Harry, unwilling to fully concede autonomy, continued to assert himself in subtle ways. Meghan's influence, public statements, and global media attention added complexity to every interaction. The palace had established authority, yes, but the human element, the emotional stakes, and the unpredictable nature of family dynamics meant that the next twist was only a matter of time. Ask yourself, what would you do if your aunt, respected and authoritative, declared that enough was enough, redefining your place in your family? How would you reconcile loyalty, personal values, and emotional pain while under global scrutiny? For Harry, this was no longer a hypothetical, it was reality. And it set the stage for the most public, dramatic, and controversial developments yet. Events where exclusion would no longer be subtle, where invitations would be denied outright, and where the unspoken rules would manifest as unmistakable public actions. Imagine waiting for an invitation to an event that defines both status and family ties, only to realize it will never arrive. For Prince Harry, this was no hypothetical scenario. It became a painful reality as the monarchy's internal decisions began to manifest in concrete, undeniable ways. Invitations, seemingly trivial to outsiders, carry extraordinary weight within royal circles. They signify inclusion, approval, and belonging. The absence of an invitation, on the other hand, is a statement of exclusion, judgment, and the recalibration of power. And in Harry's case, the missing envelopes were more than social protocol. They were a message that his place within the family had changed irrevocably. The story begins with the first signs of selective exclusion. Staff and event planners, long accustomed to the automatic presence of the younger prince, began to implement new rules. Invitations that had previously been assumed, garden parties, charitable galas, and ceremonial gatherings, were now carefully considered. Decisions were made behind closed doors, with input from William, Anne, and senior advisors. Harry's name, once automatically included, began to appear less frequently on guest lists. Each omission, each absence, was a calculated move, designed to communicate boundaries without overt confrontation. Imagine the anticipation that Harry must have felt. Royal events are not just formalities. They are markers of family hierarchy, public perception, and social influence. To be left off a list is to experience exclusion in the most visible and socially charged way possible. Invitations carry implicit expectations, and their absence carries implicit judgment. Harry, who had spent decades navigating the complex interplay of duty and autonomy, now faced the stark realization that his inclusion was no longer guaranteed, and that each absent invitation carried weight far beyond the envelope itself. The first major event where Harry was noticeably absent was a high-profile royal gala, attended by heads of state, senior royals, and global media. Friends and insiders noted that his absence was not only felt, but also widely interpreted. Conversations within the palace acknowledged the deliberate nature of the omission. Seating charts, introductions, and ceremonial roles were all carefully orchestrated to reinforce the message. Harry was not included, not as a punishment alone, but as an assertion of boundaries, protocol, and authority. The psychological impact of exclusion is profound. Being overlooked by those closest to you, especially in highly visible contexts, creates a mix of disbelief, frustration, and emotional pain. For Harry, the situation was compounded by his public role and global attention. Every missed event, every absent invitation, became fodder for speculation, media coverage, and public commentary. The personal sting of exclusion was magnified by the knowledge that the world was watching, interpreting, and judging each slight. Meanwhile, the internal response from William and the palace was deliberate and strategic. By controlling invitations, they were signaling more than just disapproval. They were managing perceptions, reinforcing hierarchy, and delineating boundaries in a manner that could not be publicly challenged. Exclusion through invitation, or lack thereof, is a subtle yet powerful tool within elite institutions. It communicates authority, enforces compliance, and establishes consequences without confrontation. And in Harry's case, it became a central mechanism through which his autonomy and freedom were tested. Meghan's influence further complicated the scenario. As Harry's partner, her presence had already altered family dynamics. Now, her influence and visibility became intertwined with decisions about invitations. The palace had to navigate a delicate balance, excluding Harry without creating public outrage, enforcing protocol without appearing petty, and managing Meghan's presence in ways that aligned with the institution's priorities. Every calculation had consequences, and every omission had layers of meaning. Public perception played a critical role. Observers, journalists, and royal commentators quickly noticed patterns. Absences, subtle references, and selective appearances became talking points. Headlines speculated on the reasons behind Harry's omissions. Was it protocol? Was it personal? Was it a reflection of growing tensions within the family? Each analysis added pressure, amplified scrutiny, and intensified the emotional stakes for the prince. The world was not just watching. He was being evaluated, judged, and compared in real time. Internally, the situation created ripple effects. Staff members, royal aides, and event planners had to navigate the tricky terrain of inclusion and exclusion. Who would speak to Harry directly about missing invitations? How would omissions be explained without causing embarrassment or further conflict? Every decision required foresight, diplomacy, and a careful understanding of both emotional and institutional consequences. The palace had effectively created a high-stakes game, where invitations functioned as both tools of control and symbols of family judgment. The emotional toll on Harry cannot be overstated. To be excluded is not merely a matter of protocol. It is an emotional indictment. Invitations are markers of trust, belonging, and validation. Their absence communicates distance, disapproval, and disconnection. For someone whose life has been defined by public expectation, personal sacrifice, and familial loyalty, the missing invitations were a stark, undeniable statement. Your presence is no longer assumed, your choices are scrutinized, and your role is now conditional. At the same time, William and Anne's coordination ensured that each exclusion was executed flawlessly. The absence of invitations was deliberate, precise, and carefully calculated to maximize impact while minimizing public fallout. In this way, the monarchy leveraged subtlety as a form of power. By controlling access, they controlled perception, reinforced hierarchy, and established boundaries without engaging in overt confrontation. The message was unmistakable. Harry's autonomy had limits, and those limits were now publicly, institutionally enforced. This strategy also had a broader psychological effect. It created uncertainty. Harry could never be sure which events would include him, which would exclude him, and what each decision implied about his relationship with the monarchy. That uncertainty, combined with the weight of public scrutiny, intensified the emotional strain. Every moment became a negotiation, every appearance a test, and every invitation, or lack thereof, a symbol of inclusion or exclusion. Ask yourself, how would you respond to being systematically excluded from family events, especially when public attention magnifies every omission? How would you navigate the delicate balance between asserting autonomy and maintaining family relationships, knowing that every decision carries both personal and institutional consequences? For Harry, these questions became daily realities, shaping decisions, influencing behavior, and deepening the divide between him and William. And just when it seemed that the message of exclusion had reached its peak, a subtle yet unmistakable escalation occurred. Invitations were not just withheld, they were redirected, altered, or otherwise manipulated to reinforce boundaries. Allies who might have supported Harry found themselves navigating a maze of expectations and rules, while Harry himself faced the stark reality. His position within the family was no longer assumed, his inclusion was no longer guaranteed, and his relationship with his brother and the monarchy had entered uncharted, precarious territory. When the world finally noticed what had been happening behind closed doors, the fallout was swift, sensational, and unavoidable. For Prince Harry, the pattern of